Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, let's go.
Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we're doing a deep dive on our 5 key concepts for skill acquisition. It's a topic that we talk about a lot, and especially in competitive sporting situations, something that everyone likes to work on. So we're just going to go on some key concepts which will help you make the most of your skill training. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsor, Wit Fitness. Please check them out at One New Change in St Paul's or at the website on wit-fitness.com and use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. Right. Skills that pay the bills.
That's
What are you
right.
thinking, Rob?
Well, for me, I say one of the obviously most important things to understand is when we're talking about skill acquisition, what is it and what area we're trying to focus on learning, right? So I think using something like CrossFit is a really interesting way to kind of look at skill acquisition because there's so many skills to acquire. I think sometimes it's a really good thing to first of all understand what it is you are trying to acquire. So what, say, one particular skill, or is there a more global skill that you can learn that kind of carries over to more other things? So
Yeah,
that's what we're probably going to address little things like that later on in the podcast. But I think one of the first things is, I guess, everything you do is a skill.
absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Something to appreciate. We touched on it actually in the assault bike experiment episode with Luke, where even the assault bike has skill involved. Everything that involves coordination is a skill that can be practiced and you can become more efficient in. There's muscle sequencing, timing, the motor patterns, and yeah, it does apply to everything. So assault bike, rowing, these are thought of as low skill movements, but somebody who's very experienced in using those machines will be more efficient and less wasteful. So developing your skill and technique on those machines is still worthwhile. I think the key question there is skill your limiter or not? And for the assault bike, doing assault bike technique sessions might not be the best use of your time. Just accumulating the skill by doing your normal conditioning pieces will probably be enough. But for more complex, nuanced movements, then skill is much more likely to be holding you back. So we've referenced it probably a few times already since we did the episode on establishing your limiter, but I think that's a really key concept to go back to. So give that a listen if you haven't already, and understand if skill is your limiter, and if it is, then this episode will hopefully be very useful for you. So we'll go
So
through it.
yeah, let
Sorry,
me
just
let me
to say,
just yeah let me just hold you. I want to pull you back a bit because you said obviously there how the assault bike with the skill you'll probably get enough volume through the movement through like workouts and stuff like that, so you gain your skill. But I'd argue that maybe some technique sessions would be but really beneficial, especially the assault bike. Assault bikes may be a bit hit and miss because it is kind of grunt work where it is you can use more legs and gradually over time you'd hope you understand that you can actually use your arms a lot as well, but really it is a leg dominant movement. But when we go across to something like a rower, you'd spend so much unnecessary energy rowing shit. And
yeah,
for me, is like as soon as I took the time and really, I did some skill-based rowing sessions, and for a little while, rather than focusing on, say, my overall capacity on the rower. And once I actually learned how to row, my my capacity didn't need to increase because I was able to do more. So for me doing, say, a 5K in, say, 25 minutes, then went to, say, 20 minutes just by learning how to row, and then going down to, say, for even faster by then actually then having a better skill and then a higher aerobic base. So I guess if I just kept rowing, I would have got better, and I would have probably tried to find my essentially my limiter, as we mentioned there. I would have eventually found that, okay, I had to use more legs with the pull, or I would create more tension with the initial first pull. So I think exposure therapy obviously is important, but I do think skill on these low skill things is quite important. Do you not think?
yeah, yeah, definitely. And I would distinguish assault bike from rower
Yeah, yeah,
in quite a
it
big
is. It
way.
is. That's why I didn't want to. I didn't want to just say like because I understand the assault bike is a lot simpler.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just work.
And well, this it kind of illustrates the point really well in that what's the best use of your time for getting your 5K time down? And early on, if your technique is poor, then spending the basic time to get a decent row technique will pay dividends, because then all the conditioning you do thereafter will be more beneficial. But for somebody who has decent rowing technique, where are you going to spend your time and effort
Yeah.
if you've only got a limited amount of training time? And I think we're always looking for bang for buck, the best use of time. So focusing on the limiter as a principle means that we're more likely to be doing that. And I think going through this episode, we're going to assume that skill is the limiter, or its skill is something we want to work on, just for the sake of argument. So we're not, we're not discussing whether or not it's a worthwhile exercise, because I think it almost always is.
Yeah.
Great. So I guess situations where we can identify skill as a limiter is, let's think of an example. Maybe somebody's a very strong guy, they've just started snatching and they've got a really heavy overhead squat, but their snatch is very, very light comparatively. It's quite a clear situation that we can see that their skill or positions or something technical is holding them back. And if they were more coordinated and able to execute a better technique, their snatch would go up. Whereas if they just started overhead squatting even heavier, then it probably wouldn't. So once we've identified that every movement is a skill and we're trying to improve our technique, how do we discern what the part of the skill we want to work on is? And this is where we come to the second concept. Concept number one is every movement is a skill. Second concept is we want to chunk up the skill into its critical features. So just like if you're learning to play a piece of music, you wouldn't just bang out the whole song every single time. You'd break it into chunks. So you practice a few bars over and over again until you've got that bar nailed before you then put it back into the overall piece. So whatever skill you're trying to work on, chunk it up into critical features that come together as a whole, so you can work on them in a little bit of isolation. And I think weightlifters do this really, really well, where there's some very clear critical features in terms of setup position, the pull, the bar path, the catch, and then the squat mechanics when you're receiving the bar. And you can work on those very clearly in isolation, which is where all the weightlifting variations come about. And I think you've had a lot of experience with that, Rob, when you've been improving your weightlifting.
Yeah, I definitely have. And the thing is as well, it's the type of thing where the more time you can obviously spend on, say, these limiters that we've obviously discussed. And I think this is really important because we have touched on these points, as you mentioned before, in like our limiter episode, and also when we've spoken about our accessory episode as well. A lot of these things, training is like this whole entity where when you can identify each piece, it really can help create a broader picture. And this thing of chunking the skill up to find your bits that's wrong is, I guess, hammering the limiter point home. But understanding that, like for instance, when it comes to the weightlifting side of things, is I think you had a good example there when you said about having a good overhead squat compared to a snatch. And that was me for quite a good while, because I had the strength, I had the ability to hold a weight overhead. But then when I tried to use it in a more dynamic fashion, it didn't catch up. And also on the bit of that as well, even the skill of getting the bar from my shoulders to overhead limited my overhead squat, because I couldn't jerk it properly into position because I wasn't comfortable doing behind the neck jerks. And I weren't. So then I remember trying 140 a couple of times, and the part that I kept failing was getting it overhead, which was draining so much energy from me just trying to get it up, let alone actually performing the task at hand. But yeah, no, it's so important. But then, as we said, like when you start to understand the parts of the movement that you are struggling with, it's like that's where we can obviously then start to acquire that skill.
Exactly. So I think how do we choose our chunk is basically the next question to answer, and these can be infinitesimally small chunks. Struggling with that
I
one.
like that.
And we could go down to, you could go ridiculous down to, I'm going to work on one finger at a time to improve how this one finger works in this lift. But that's probably not a great use of our time. So how do we make this decision? Like, we want to stay as high up the spectrum of specificity as we can. So getting as close to the skill that we're trying to improve overall, but provided that we're getting the right stimulus. So let's give you some examples to bring this to life a little bit. If we're trying to work on something positional, so the skill of ankle dorsiflexion in squatting, so knees over toes when we're catching the bar in weightlifting, ideally, we'd be improving that position in our overhead squat or in our front squat. However, we might find that when we're doing those big gross overall movements, our hips are actually the limiter, so we can't improve that ankle dorsiflexion. So we need to take a step out and away from the position of the sport so that we can work the dorsiflexion in a little bit of isolation before we can bring it back into the main overall movement. And another example there could be if we're looking to work on wrist stability, we probably don't want to work wrist stability in isolation if we can work it with shoulder stability and core stability and lower body stability, say for a jerk. If somebody's got unstable wrists, if we are able to get that stimulus all together, we should get it all together. And only if the shoulders are the limiter instead, that would be the only situation where the wrist stability isn't getting challenged. We might want to do an exercise tweaking it out of the more sporting scenario. So I think when we are choosing our chunk, those are the main considerations. Like, can we still get the stimulus in the main skill, or do we need to become a little bit more abstract? And the other consideration that's really important here when choosing the chunks is how can we accumulate the most quality reps? Because if something else is going to limit the amount of practice you can do on the skill you're trying to improve, there is a trade-off of specificity versus reps. Like, if you're doing, if we're trying to work on our descent when we catch a snatch, if we snatched every time, we'd probably be able to do less reps than if we just worked snatch balance. So we can actually practice that skill more because we're removing the other part of the lift. So we're trading off specificity versus total reps, which we'll come on to later in the episode.
Yeah, I guess really good points there, where we're always trying to stay as close to the movement itself. But at times with something like, say, keeping with the snatch analogy, is that if we're having to constantly pull from the floor, catch it perfectly overhead to then ride it down, the amount of effort and time and then actually load will then start getting affected. Whereas if you did a snatch balance, you can easily say, I say easily very loosely, but you should get to comfortably your 1RM snatch in a snatch balance before you even say go and snatch. You should be able to, it should be a really good warm up for you, because you're getting all your stabilizers all working together in as close to the movement as possible without doing the movement. And you'd obviously be warming up, say, your pull and all those bits. This is why also when people do say even snatch pulls, they normally go above and beyond their 1RM, just so then they know what that feeling of lifting off the floor, because the limiter a lot of the time isn't necessarily the pull. It's then the ability of getting it from hips to overhead and actually keeping the bar path tight, keeping your position throughout, and then being able to catch it. So it's then we have the opportunity to piece our chunks together. So you might be doing your snatch pulls heavy, you're doing your snatch balances heavy, and then you pair it all together and bang, you have a more technical snatch. And I think it was what I really liked was there where you also mentioned about like the ankle dorsiflexion part in the squat, and you might actually have to take yourself out of the squat to work on it. And I think that lends nicely to like your lunges and stuff that you obviously do quite a lot with clients, and because it takes you into the specific leg, the specific ankle necessary that needs that little extra work. Because a lot of the time, sometimes it's not even both ankles. Sometimes it is one more than the other, because that then causes the body to twist, and that causes then the hips to be impinged. And there's going to be a whole chain of events because of a dodgy, say, left ankle.
exactly. Yeah. So the key, principle is we only take it out of sport as far as we need to get our intended stimulus. So we're doing snatch pulls. Everything is the same, except we're not finishing the snatch. And because of that, the stimulus is challenging the pull to be stronger or faster, whatever, or a better bar path. And we can overload to a level that we couldn't do if we were trying to do a full snatch. So we're getting that skill stimulation and able to do more of it because we've chunked it up and addressed it in a little bit of isolation, but only as much as is necessary.
Exactly. And I do, and I think it's really also important to then understand that when we are taking these movements, and we understand that they're going to hopefully then obviously carry over to the main lift itself, whatever that lift will be, is that just because you can say snatch, pull 130% of your 1RM doesn't mean you're then going to now be able to then lift more, because at the end of the day you still need to be able to stabilize that weight overhead. And I think this carries over a lot with people squatting. And the reason why I say this is because I've heard this a lot, and also from clients where they box squatted, say 180 kilos as an example, right? And they had this, of course, so box out probably about like maybe 10% less, and like you have no idea. And but then they feel bad that their back squat isn't as close to their box squat. It's like they're two completely different exercises. Like, they don't get me wrong, they carry over for leg strength, but it's essentially like a leg press, but that you have to stabilize more. And this is, I think, as long as you also have a realistic expectation of the skill that you're trying to build, and that it is just part of it, it is not the skill itself, is very key.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a great example. Like the box squat and the snatch pull, you could have a 130% snatch pull, 110% snatch balance. It doesn't mean that you're going to PB your snatch. But if we look at all the key criteria, the key components of the skill, and we level them all up, we've got a really good chance that when we string them together, they will lead to an overall better performance. But that assumes we have ironed out the limiter in that process as well, which is why we keep coming back to that point.
Yeah.
Great. Next concept, how the body learns. So practice makes perfect is the common saying that people say, but now people are starting to upgrade that to deliberate practice makes perfect, or meaningful practice makes perfect. And the point that we're trying to make here is that we need to be directing our efforts in a deliberate direction. It's not just enough to hammer out meaningless volume. If we want change in a certain direction, being conscious of that direction and setting ourselves up to improve in that direction has to be in place. Like, there's no point just doing 100 reps of snatch without thinking about what you're doing, without trying to change an element of your technique or have some goal in mind for what we want the snatch to look like. We have to be aware of the variables in the snatch. So the key criteria we talked about, but also what are we looking to change? So a principle of movement is that it should be subconscious in sport. So no powerful, high-performing movement is a series of conscious muscle contractions. And I think this is something that has become quite confusing because of bodybuilding, where the mind-muscle connection and very deliberate conscious contractions do have a really important part to play. But that's not in sport. You don't have Usain Bolt thinking about his calf or his hamstring or his hip flexor or his quad when he's running 9.6 something second 100 meters. It's very fluid. It's very smooth and coordinated teamwork between all the muscles working in harmony. And we want to train our skills to work like that as well. So what does that mean? That basically means our motor patterns should be reactive. We're essentially connecting our proprioceptors with our motor neurons. So our proprioceptors are the things that detect our position in space through balance or stretch, and our motor neurons are the ones that then tell our muscles what to do. So the easiest example of this to picture is balancing. When you're balancing, you're standing on 1 or 2 feet even, you're constantly getting information from your feet about where the weight is distributed. And as you start to lean over one way, the opposite side of your body will contract those muscles to bring you back to neutral so you don't fall over. And if you ever watch a baby learning to walk, that's why they wobble more than an adult, is because they're less skilled in the balance, in the skill of balancing and standing upright. So their proprioceptors need to detect greater variance before those reactive muscle contractions write them up. And we can see there that the variable, the variance around neutral, which is the goal, is much greater until they get skilled in the movement, and then their proprioceptors are more sensitive and able to detect smaller variance around the goal. So when we're applying this to learning a skill in sport, we need to be aware of what those variables are and manipulate them to give the body an experience of going too far in each way, so it can then find its happy medium by itself subconsciously.
Nicely put, mate. So two things on this that I want to kind of just touch on, and it's, I think, really important, that part that you mentioned about the deliberate practice makes perfect. And I think I can pull this right back to the start where we mentioned about the assault bike. And it's like, you can get better at the assault bike through deliberate practice of then remembering to use your arms and understanding that, okay, where are some of the limiters? And that might be just as soon as your heart rate jacks up, that then the skill of using your arms, you just go into like default mode. But this is then where we want a new default mode of arms is pulling and making, so it's having that conscious understanding that what I'm trying to get at is that if you understand that the assault bike isn't just legs, and that you understand you need to use your arms to some degree, it really helps, rather than your arms just holding onto the handles. And I think once someone learns that bit of information, they can then start to then acquire the skill of using more arms and stuff through exposure therapy. And I just think it's that deliberate practice, because you have to remember to use your arms when you don't. Until you learn, and it's now for me, I know I need to use my arms, and you can create a lot of power from pulling more as well. So, and then I think something I also wanted to touch on there was when you was mentioning about proprioceptions, and how obviously that's where we understand where we are in space and time. And this is where I don't know if I'm right in thinking, but if I'm, say, doing 3 sets, I always end on the second set, I always start on the weaker side. So then that is then, especially if I'm doing any single leg movement or anything like that, because I need more energy and focus to keep my proprioception on point when I'm trying to focus on, say, a weaker side. So rather than always doing that second, I'm getting everything I can there. So it's essentially a bit like pre-fatigue in a way. So I'm post-fatigue, so where I'm trying to make sure I've got that movement down in the first set. So I do my stronger side first. So I'm getting those motor neurons to fire correctly. So I'm thinking, right, this is what the skill is supposed to feel like. And then in the second set, I can say, right, this is your weaker side. So I can now put more energy, so I can keep the motor neurons firing, focus, and all the energy all going to that weaker side, to make sure I can then hopefully improve that skill over time on my weaker side.
Yeah, I think the common thread between those 2 points is basically having a connection between what you're focusing on and what the outcome is. So by being deliberate, either through concentrating on your arms on the assault bike, or using the strong side to figure out the motor pattern and then focusing on that motor pattern on the weak side, you are connecting that focus point with the result. So if you're on the assault bike and you're thinking, I'm going to use my arms for this interval, you'll see that your performance improves, hopefully. So you can see literally your output or your performance in the interval, or having a sense of the feeling of doing the same amount of work. And equally, if you're connecting your balance, for example, on a single leg exercise, you can connect the focus point of whatever your cue is, whether it's keeping all 3 points of contact in your foot or whatever it is for you that you need to focus on, with the outcome, which is executing the exercise well. And it's no different to the baby learning to walk and connecting falling over with, or not falling over with whatever's going on subconsciously. And Movement mechanics is essentially just skill work where we're working on a more optimal balance of muscles and physics to get the job done. And great coaching essentially just gives you the right focus point to create better movement patterns. So whether you're learning to snatch, learning to hit a forehand, you should be thinking about the one thing that's going to improve the overall outcome, which almost never is a muscle. In tennis, it could be, we're jumping ahead a little bit now, but where the racket is in your backswing. So I'm going to use an example I had lined up for later where one of my mates would always bum his backhand into the net. And basically it's because his racket was above his head and he was chopping down on it so much that it was always hitting the ball down. And he's quite tall, so he could get away with it, but it's just not a great swing plane. So for him, the focus point was bringing back the backhand flatter below his shoulder and maybe even lower than his hip. So he's hitting up on the ball a little bit more. And once he could focus on that, he could connect it to the result of hitting the ball over the net. And then he gets the feeling subconsciously, his proprioceptors are detecting, what does it feel like to swing, to have the backswing on my backhand here? And then, I can now connect the dots and see that I'm hitting it over the net rather than into the net. So he's then learned that skill. So with enough reps, he will do that subconsciously rather than having that high backswing, which was resulting in hitting in the net. So we're just tapping into the neurology of skill acquisition there.
Yeah, and I think what's really important is like, obviously this is how, as to reiterate, like the title of this point of being of how the body learns. And it's once you have learnt these skills, they do stay relatively ingrained. They might become rusty, but they do stay ingrained. And I think it's so important to like gain a good understanding of a movement, because it will pay, like as we mentioned earlier, like with the rower and everything. Once you learn these skills, the better the skill, just we touched on it all before as well, the more efficient you're going to be, the better everything is just going to improve so much more. But it's just, I guess the skill acquisition part can be extremely frustrating for some, and it can be quite boring for some, even though that's part of the journey. And we always see the end of the movement being like the sexy lift that we want. We want that snatch. We want it to look a certain way, but it's like, it's quite hard for us to sometimes think about the skills that we need to learn to get ourselves to that point. And we're always thinking about, cool, okay, it needs to look like this. And it's like, well, it doesn't need to. That's how it wants to hopefully get towards at the end. Yours might not even look like that. We're going to look slightly different. So focus on these particular parts, and then we can then obviously continue from there. So I guess it does get into our next point of picking the right variables, right?
Massively, yeah. So that's exactly the process where if we have the outcome in mind or the end product in mind, doing a bit of spot the difference between where you are now and where you want to be in terms of technique helps us pick our variables. So we could do loads of random training, but we know random training gets random results. So if we can see what our limiter is, or where the element of the skill we want isn't present. So if you compared my mate's backhand to Roger Federer's backhand, you would see that Federer starts with the racket lower and hits up on the ball for his backhand. And there we have a key variable, racket height in the backswing, that we need to work on. So focusing on that as the variable, playing with different heights of backswing to feel what feels right and what produces the best outcomes is the process. And I think the easiest way to illustrate this is just with a few examples. The backhand one's great. Bar path in weightlifting or deadlifting, playing with having the bar too close, and it's pulling your balance backwards, too far away, forwards, and then you sort of find the Goldilocks happy medium of, okay, this now means I hit more lifts, feels easier. That's probably a more optimal bar path. And doing that constant comparison of this is what mine looks like to this is what the best in the world looks like is always a useful exercise and a starting point for where you might want to work on specific variables. My favorite example, I think, of using variables to your advantage is of a table tennis player who had famously fast reactions, and it basically turned out it's because he learned to play in a shed where he was forced to be very close to the table, so he just had less time to react. And the variable there is time to react. So he was forced into developing those skills through overstimulation, through having much less time than he would do in a real match scenario. So if you are struggling with a certain part of your sport, trying to overload that element, provided you're getting successful results, is the way to target it, like working your weaknesses and all those cheesy cliches. I think one that's super relevant for CrossFit that I want to highlight is the ability to lift heavy under fatigue, because that does come up in a lot of competitions. And if you've got a great 1 rep max, but you can never pull it out in a competition, then trying to replicate those situations by, doing a bit of cardio, doing another sort of conflicting movement, going straight into your lifts, again, overloads that skill of the sport, which is heavy lifting under fatigue, which you want to be prepared for, obviously, and build up to it gradually.
Yeah, I guess it's always boils down to the specificity of I got it there, the specificity of what it is you're doing, and we always hone back into this, but understanding why you're doing what you're doing. And I think the CrossFit one was a really good example, because it's like, you obviously go through strength cycles where you're going to build, and you won't be doing pre-fatigue, but then you're not being sport specific, but you're being a segment of your sport specific. So you're getting stronger at a lift. So then hopefully when you then get to your pre-fatigue, and then when you pre-fatigue it with a form of aerobic work or whatever, and then go into a heavy lift, where it was, say, only 80 kilos is now 90 kilos, because you've built up that strength. And then getting the exposure of pre-fatiguing yourself and then doing your heavy lift is the specific thing needed for your sport. And one of the things I kind of wanted to bring, I've completely forgotten before I was going with that one.
I'll jump in.
So go on, you jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, there's a caveat I wanted to make around picking your variables, and that is, the more skilled you become, the tighter your variables need to be. So for a beginner playing tennis, it might be enough to ask them to hit one side of the court, like any depth, but you've got a whole half the court to aim for, and we'd be happy with left or right. But as you get better at it, you're going to be hitting a narrower target and also a shorter target. So pros, they might aim for a specific cone, like a few centimeters in square to target, because for them to get a skill stimulus, the boundaries need to be that much tighter. And the same goes for like a high level weightlifter. They'd have a much lower degree of variance around perfect bar path compared to a beginner, where you'd let them pull it way out in front and way into themselves to start to narrow in and hone in on their point. And to finish that little set, if we're looking at that lifting under fatigue for a beginner, 0 fatigue, and as the CrossFitter gets more experience, they might go from a moderate cardio interval into a heavy lift. And then for a games athlete, they might be doing a very hard interval, maybe some chest to bar or something that would actually interfere with their ability to pull, and then going into a heavy lift to increase the level of difficulty and increase the sport specificity.
Nice. That's where I was kind of going to go to. It is, as you said, it is. I think when you mentioned about your tennis mate, and I think what's really important is you're picking the right person to compare yourself to, because depending on your level depends on how far up the spectrum you want to compare yourself to. Because if you're a beginner and you're comparing yourself to Roger Federer, he's going to have his way of doing things. So where I like to, as you said, is I like to try and think of it as like you've got a ballpark of where you roughly want to be. So as you said, roughly below the shoulders. and that's where you're roughly going to go. And then you start to fine tune, because you're looking at, right, this is what the pros, maybe not just Roger Federer, but you're going to look at maybe someone of a similar height to you. You're going to pick a few athletes that are similar to you, or where you'd like to hopefully get towards, and then look at how they execute, and then say, right, what is the average of these people, say backhands or whatever, and that's where I'm going to try and aim for, because you know they must be doing something right to be there. And that's the thing, you're not then going to pick one of the shortest tennis players and say right there, because they're going to be having to counteract other movements and other positions. I guess I'm not really great at tennis, but it's one of the things that it does make me think of is when you said there about how the professional starts aiming towards like the cone or the specific spot, is in like when you're a beginner, you're aiming for a field, and when you become into the pro, you're aiming for like a golf hole. So you're saying like that's how big of a discrepancy you start to really narrow your focus down to, because you have to build to that, but you do have to understand where you are on the spectrum to understand where you need to start applying the specific variables.
That's a really good point. I think keeping yourself in success is important for motivation, if nothing else. So if you've got a beginner tennis player and you're asking them to hit a cone, 99 times out of 100, they're not going to hit it. So they're going to feel like a failure. They're going to lose interest and motivation. So having a realistic objective, which gets the stimulus of improving your accuracy without, just feeling like you're absolute dog shit, I think is important for the process, not just from a motivation point of view, but actually from a like trying to hit a cone when you can't hit half a tennis court, you're actually struggling. Like you're really going to struggle to develop your capacity to improve accuracy if you have no idea why you're missing. So having a more basically an easier version of the task where you can actually connect that outcome with your focus point
and fine
means
tune
that
along the way.
you're going to work within those boundaries much more realistically.
And I guess that kind of leads on to our last one of being just doing the work over and over. So reps, because it's that aiming for like the big part of the court before the cone means you can start to work in. So you got the whole half of the court, then you got the box to the court, then you got half of the box, and then but that only comes through time and practice and over and over and over again. And it's like that's how we can start to learn the skill. But as you say, keep motivated, keep us turning up, and we always need to find those mini wins, because no one likes to leave defeated. Even if you're like a high level and you understand that not every day is going to be a good day, you always want to try and find something of that session, of that task that you've done, because it leaves you feeling better. So it makes you want to go back to get better even more the next time and next time. It's that constant journey.
Exactly. I think the key point about the reps, there are no shortcuts to skill acquisition. If you want to get good at anything, you've just got to do it a lot. And the sort of science behind this is a phenomenon called myelination. So in any motor pattern, we're essentially sending signals through our nerves, our neurons, either from the brain or somewhere else, to the working muscles. And it's basically, just an electrical signal going down this biological wire. When we use that wire over and over and over again, your body thinks, how can I make this a little bit easier or faster or more efficient? And it lays down these fatty sheaths, which are made of myelin. And these fatty sheaths basically cause that impulse to jump rather than run down the wire. So it travels faster. So that process of proprioception we talked about earlier, connecting our information in to our information out, the muscle contraction, happens more effectively and sooner. And this is why pro athletes have seemingly impossibly fast reactions, because they've just done that skill so many times that those nervous pathways are more myelinated than a beginner's. And the only way to do this is through use. So you've got to grease the groove, you've got to put in the work, do the reps, so that your body lays down those myelinated nervous pathways.
It's like a massive game of leapfrog. Rather than running 100 meters, you do a big game of leapfrog, and the quicker it gets down there, you're just missing that meters and meters because you're essentially floating in the air. So it's just easy. So Mate, love that one. Really, really good. So I just want to really maybe just hone back in on those 5 key concepts that we've said for skill acquisition. And that's understanding that every movement is a skill, and obviously understanding what you have to try and learn as a skill is important. So understanding where you are and what you need to do. Second one is obviously chunk the skill up into its critical features. So things like understanding where to set up, what the bar path is, like all these little things, or in tennis, like forehand and all these tennis words I'm not too sure about. How the body learns is point number 3. Point number 4, picking the right variables. And point number 5 is doing the work of reps, reps, and reps. So, Ash, anything else to add on?
No, that was nicely done, mate. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Cheers. So, as always, guys, we really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Skill acquisition is one of those things where it can feel quite boring to some, but understand the more time you do put in, as we mentioned on that last point of reps, 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 it starts to get very fun because then things become a lot more natural feeling and you can do things a lot better. So put in the work and it will pay dividends. And as always, thank you very much for listening. If you did enjoy the episode, please do share it with someone that you think might appreciate it. And if they might not appreciate it, just share it with them anyway. Don't forget to leave us a review on Apple iTunes and subscribe to us on YouTube. It starts to help us build our YouTube following as well. We would love that. So as always, thank you for your time and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.